everyone. Welcome back to Coding from Null. Last week we finished up most of the design aspects of our coming soon page that we're building, and now we're going to start transitioning to how we get this thing ready for deployment. But the first thing that I want to touch on, what we're going to cover in this video, is we're going to go over both the React dev tools and a lot of the Chrome dev tools that can make your development experience just way easier when you know how to leverage these sort of tools. So let's go ahead and start digging into that. All right, so let's start learning all about these dev tools that you can use when you're developing your applications. Now, right now, what I have is I've already spun up, I've already started the server side of our application as well as the client side. So we can see some of the network traffic and stuff that will be going on. The first part of this tutorial, we will cover the Chrome dev tools specifically. These are great. There's a ton in there that you can use, give you better insight into your websites and applications. We will only really be scratching the surface. There's just a ton in there, but I implore you to go out and try to learn as much about the dev tools as you can, because they're really super useful. The second part, we will be digging into the React dev tools specifically and how we can use those for our React application. So let's go ahead and bring up our Chrome here, and I'll just hit Control-Shift-I, which will pop up my dev tools. Now, the first tab that we'll be going over is the Elements tab. This is really super useful. It just gives us all the HTML and CSS that's on our page. You can see all the elements of our React application. Here's our root element, our background. We can see all the elements that get rendered out once our components are built. Now, say I want to inspect a specific element. There's something funky going on and I need to debug it. Just hit inspect. It'll pop it up right here. This is real super useful for, obviously we have a fairly small web application here, but if you had something really big, this is just a real quick way to highlight that specific element. We can see the element here. We can see the inner text here. We can see the margin, the border, the padding. We can see all the CSS styles that are being applied to that specific element. Basically goes in order of specificity. So we have our class here first. This is the border box sizing that we set, I believe, at the HTML level. I can't remember. We also have paragraph specific styles. These are the user agent style sheet. If you ever see that user agent, this is basically meaning these are the styles that Chrome is applying to this paragraph tag. And then we see some other stuff like for the description, and these are inherited styles that it's getting from description, which is the div tag right here. One cool thing about this is you can change these styles on the fly. That's really super useful if you're needing to debug some CSS or something like that. So I'll do is we'll set the border on this to px solid red, and then it just gives us all the bounds of that element, which is really super useful. I use that one a lot. Again, we can see the border here now highlighted there. The next thing that you can do is you can also look at like states of elements. So say, for instance, in our application, we were doing some hover stuff. So when we hover over this, it is changing the brightness because we're setting a CSS filter on it. And say, like, I don't know, we put that in our CSS and for some reason it's not really working and we're not really sure why. You can definitely come in here and we can go, okay, what does the hover state of this element look like? What is the visited state? What is the active state, focus state. You can see this focus state. We get this blue box around this one. Well, let's go ahead and inspect the button here. And so if I click hover, you can see it changes that filter because it's changing the brightness because it's applying that filter. And then we can see that down here. If I close this? Anyway, if we look right here, we can see the hover style being applied. This filter brightness. See the check marks, the boxes marked. I don't know. Some of these are kind of funky. There we go. Yeah, so the filter brightness 85% is being set because we set the hover. We click it off and it takes it off. We can see again like the focus state, the active state, again the hover state, all that stuff. So that's really super useful. I really like digging in with these ones because I do a lot of changing the CSS on hover and things like that. Let's go ahead and inspect this. I'll take this red off of here. The next one that we'll go into is the console. Console, really super useful. I usually use console.log throughout my applications all the time. It's really super nice to see what a variable is at a specific state in your application. All sorts of stuff. If we're firing off an event, what does that event look like? You can just log it to the console and you'll see it up in here. If it's on the client side of the application, of course. I usually preserve the log, which just doesn't reset it every time there's a page refresh or anything like that. I like to preserve the log because you can always just clear the console by pressing this. What's also super useful is you can write CSS directly into here. So, you can set variables. No, I've already declared this one. But we can just say A, and then this equals 11. You can do all sorts of stuff in the console that's really super useful when you're developing your application. The next one that we'll cover is the network tab because we are hitting an API when we submit an email address for our mailing list. And it's really super useful to see everything that's going on with that request when it happens. So let's go ahead and I'll just submit something here. This is going to give me a little bit of an error because this is already in my mailing list. So we get our nice little warning notification that this is already a member of the mailing list. But more importantly, we can see all the stuff about that request. So we can see this is hitting our member add function for our internal API. And then it's passing, we can see the query parameter that's being passed is the that email address there. Now, if I click onto this request, I get all sorts of information, including the headers that are going along with the request. We can see any like authorization headers or anything that's being sent along. We can preview what's coming back. So we looked into this a bit when we were looking at Postman and testing our API. This is just another similar way that we can view that information coming back. You can see we're getting a 400 status. The member already exists, which we're then checking in our application and then saying, hey, you're already a member of our email mailing list. So that's that part. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in here. You can see this response here. We can see cookies that are being passed and all sorts of other stuff that is really super useful when you're dealing with any sort of network requests. Hitting an API, of course, is definitely a perfect use case for using the network tab. We can also see performance, memory. There's all sorts of other tabs that we can go into up here. One thing that I'll just show real quick is application. This one is really super useful if you're dealing with anything with local storage. We can see we have some stuff here. This is actually, I can delete that. I don't know why that's in there. I think that was from another. Oh, these are from a tutorial that I was doing earlier. But we could set I could set something into my local storage if I wanted. Here, I could add new. This is real super useful. Like if, for instance, you have like a light and dark mode for your website and you're using local storage to store that value so that when your user comes back to your website, you can pull it down out of local storage instead of them having to reset that every time they come into the website. And we could see that. We could see the key value pair in here when we're dealing with that. And then again, there's just a whole host of other stuff in here. I'm not going to go into all of it, but just wanted to touch on the local storage part, which is really, I've found really super useful. Another thing that we look at real quick is just this audits tab. I'll spend an entire tutorial about this in maybe a couple of weeks or so. But this is really super useful. It's this tool called Lighthouse that is now built directly into Chrome and just gives us some really good insight into our application concerning things like accessibility, performance, all that sort of stuff. We can do it both for mobile and desktop. Basically, it will run an audit on our website and it will give us a score based on some of these things, and it will give us some nice insight and ways to improve those scores. So really super useful tool here. And I think that's the last tab of the actual Chrome Dev Tools that I'll be looking into. And now we'll start digging into the React Dev Tools. So we can see here, let's go ahead and pull up the initial state of our application here real quick. Let's bring up coming soon, our top level component, and just give a look at some of the state that we have in the application when we first started up. So here we have our entire state object that we're setting for our application. We can see all of the data that we're setting in state for all the logo. We're passing a date string here. We've got our description. We've got all our social media links, our notification settings, all that. So let's go ahead and look at the React Dev Tools. So I've got two of them here. One's the components and one's the profiler. We can just give a real quick look at the profiler. It's not real super useful in this context because it's just such a small application. But if you were really worried about something like performance, this is a pretty useful tool. So let's go ahead and you can hit this start profiling button, and I'll just go ahead and I'll type some stuff in here. Then hit stop profiling. We can see like when we are doing certain things and components are getting rendered out to the page, what is taking the longest and stuff. So we can see the logo and the links and stuff. And okay, this is taking 1.2 milliseconds, 0.5 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. Really super useful for, like I said, determining, some sort of performance issues when your components are being rendered to the page and things like that. Not really applicable in this instance, but definitely something to be aware of. And there's just a whole host of other stuff that you can do in here as well. The main one that we'll be focusing on, though, is this components one. Now, this is really super nice. This is giving us, we can see a little tree view of all the components in our application. Ours is pretty simple, so we only have this, a few here. Let's go ahead and look at our coming soon component. We can see all our state, right? This is all the initial state that we set. But we can also see when these state objects change and stuff. Like, for instance, like we have this spin speed slow here. And when I type in, we'll say test at test.com, submit, we can see when that logo or the spin speed changes from fast to slow, vice versa. We can also see the stuff in the notification as well when that stuff changes. So let's go ahead and we'll go another one here. Mail.com. And we can see when all that state changes as well. Really super useful. And we can see all of that state object. This doesn't have any props, but if we go to countdown, we can see the props that we're passing into countdown, that date string. We can see the state of that as well. So we can see our seconds counting down, which is awesome. These are really, really super useful if you're really trying to figure out, like, oh, maybe my component isn't really working the way I'd expect. Like some data is not coming in. It's a lot easier to view that sort of stuff through these tools and see what are my props at this specific point in time, or what is my state at this specific point in time, things like that, which is really super useful. And like I said, we can see all the props being passed down to each of these. So I can see my description. Here's all this stuff that's being passed. And then I can see the notification where it gets passed from coming soon to description to notification. We can see that sort of prop drilling. We also get where those props are coming from. So you can see that sort of the hierarchy here. These props are coming from coming soon through description. And then this is sort of what we're getting here. Then we have our subscribe. We can see in our subscribe that different from other components that we have, we can see the function that we're passing along as props here as well. Again, we see our state there. And when you have an array like our links, it'll give you your array of objects that you can interrogate through here as well. So just a bunch of really nice tools to use whenever you're trying to debug any sort of issue or anything like that in your React application. You can also, if your application is really super big, ours is not, but you can search for a specific component up here, which is really super useful as well. It'll pull up all those components that match that title. It also, I think it takes in rejects as well if you want to use that. But yeah, very, very super useful tools. And I think that just about covers pretty much all the things I wanted to cover in this tutorial. I think there's a lot there, and I think that you can take some time and really dig into some of those tabs and just figure out what works best for you. I've kind of shown you kind of a high level thing of, a lot of the tools that I've found useful, but I'd really suggest just, using those for your own website and your own applications and seeing what works for you. And just because there's so much in there and just a lot of useful, really cool tools in there. So that is it for this week. I will see you all next week.